Hi everyone, I'm Krystal, and if you're new to card making like I am, then I'm guessing you might feel a little bit overwhelmed. There are so many amazing products out there and so many designers inspiring us to use those products that it can all just feel a little bit daunting. So today, I'm going to show you a very simple single layer card that uses only a few products and some basic techniques that are very forgiving, and that will help you start to build your card making skill set. I'll also show you a couple of ways that you can take that very simple design and add to it to create something with a little bit more pizzazz. So let's get started. This is the card that we're going to be making today. You can see it's a single layer card with some inking and a stamped sentiment. So before you get started, you definitely want to prep the surface of your work area. I've used an inexpensive craft mat and laid that down on my desk. Because we're going to be doing some inking, it might get a little messy, so you definitely want to lay something down to protect the area you're going to be working on. Then I've grabbed a pre-made A2 card base. This is one from Scrapbook.com. It's a Nina Solar white cardstock that's already cut to A2 size and has already been scored in the right place. That just makes it super easy for me. I don't have to work out exactly what size to cut my cardstock or where to score it. Because I like the look of a border around the focal point of my card, I need to mask off part of the front of this card. So I am marking 1/2 inch from all 4 sides of the front panel using a T-square ruler and a pencil. You can certainly not do this step if you want the focal point to cover the entire front of the card. Personally, I just like the look of that white border, so it's worth the extra effort to me. To mask off the front of this card, I'm going to be using some mint tape. So I have a roll of mint tape, and then I've also cut just a piece of scratch paper to the size of an A2 card just to protect the left-hand side. I haven't folded this card yet for a reason, and I want to make sure that I don't get any ink on the back side of this card by accident. I'm a fairly messy stamper, so I tend to get ink all over the place, all over my hands as I'm working, and I don't want to accidentally get ink on the back of this card. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover it with a piece of paper. I'm going to use the mint tape to tape down that paper, and I'm just lining it up with those marks that I made so that it's covering 1/2 inch of the front of this card panel as well. Then I'm going to do the same thing on all of the other 3 sides, just using those pencil marks to line up the tape, and then I'm also using the T-square ruler to make sure that the tape is perfectly straight. Now that all 4 sides are masked off, I'm going to use that tape as a way to hold my panel in place on my craft mat as well. So I just pressed it down to the craft mat to make sure that the panel doesn't slide around as I'm inking. So these are the 2 inks that I used for the cards I showed you in the beginning. For this one, I'm going to use Mustard Seed. The other one is Ripe Persimmon. They're both Distress Oxide inks from Ranger and Tim Holtz. And I'm using a domed foam blending tool from Scrapbook.com to apply it. I also showed you one of the foam daubers from Scrapbook.com. Those are slightly less expensive, and they generally do the same job. So if you don't want to invest in one of the domed foam blending tools, you can certainly give it a try with the foam dauber. If you're just starting out and don't want to spend a lot on tools just to try out this new hobby, that's a good option. So I'm just adding ink to the domed blender and then very lightly covering the entire exposed surface with this mustard seed ink. I'm not worried about it being too perfectly blended. I don't need a completely smooth surface. I actually kind of like the look of it being a little bit imperfect when the card is finished, so that doesn't bother me. But I do want to make sure that I've covered all of the exposed surface of this card with the ink. And I tend to just kind of start off of the card and go in a circular motion and work my way onto the card. I find that prevents kind of the bigger globs of ink that can sometimes happen when you go straight from the ink pad to your card panel. So we're going to layer ink here. I've grabbed the Mum stencil. This is also from Scrapbook.com. I'm going to layer it over the top of my card, which is still taped in place. I haven't moved it at all. I'm going to use a little bit more of that mint tape to tape down the stencil, and then I'm going to use the exact same ink to ink over the stencil. So I'm just layering the same ink over itself to get a darker, more saturated version of this mustard seed color. So you only need 1 ink pad to be able to make this card. It's very simple, but the end result is really beautiful. So I want to make sure that I get good coverage of this ink over this stencil. The holes on the stencil are very small, so I have to really kind of work the ink in to make sure that I get really good coverage onto my card. If you're not sure whether you're getting good enough coverage, you can lift up one side of the stencil without moving the other side. So I've taped two sides. I can lift up just that one side to make sure that I have the coverage that I'm looking for before lifting up the whole thing and then having to try to realign it. So once I have all the ink that I need on this card, I'm going to just take a look at it to make sure it's exactly the way I want it, and then I will remove the stencil. So I'm showing you the creation of this card in real time so that you can get a feel for exactly how long something like this takes. So you're seeing me ink this panel in the exact time it took me to actually ink it. You can see I lifted it up. I thought it needed a little bit more ink in a few places, so I added more, and then I'm ready to finally move on with this process. So this next part is actually my very favorite part of the entire process. I love the big reveal when you start to peel off the tape and get to see that crisp line and the results of all of your efforts. So I'm just going to peel off all four sides. I'm doing it very carefully, although this mint tape does not tear the paper ever. I have not had any issue with it. It's worked like a dream, but I do still want to be careful just to make sure that I don't accidentally rip anything. I am also being careful to not make a mess on the white parts of my card. You can see I checked my fingers for ink, and then I grabbed just a little rag to hold down the card while I peeled up the tape so that I don't get my messy fingerprints all over the front of this card. There you can see that gorgeous layered ink. It really does give it a lot of depth, even though it's a single ink color. I really like the result. I still have those pencil marks there, so I'm just taking an eraser and very lightly erasing any visible marks. You can make sure that your tape is outside of your pencil marks, and then you definitely won't be able to see them. I wasn't too careful when I did it, so I had a few showing, but no problem, they erased very easily. Okay, so to add a sentiment to this card, I am going to be using the Cards for Kindness stamp set from Scrapbook.com. I love this stamp set. I think it's perfect for new card makers because you can get so many different types of cards from this one stamp set. There's a happy birthday sentiment, a thank you sentiment, a thinking of you, a hugs, the word sunshine, and lots of little elements. It's a really great stamp for beginner card makers. So I'm using a MISTI tool to stamp my sentiment today. This is certainly not necessary. You can use an acrylic block. You will get the same exact result, but I'm not a very confident stamper, so I find that if I use my MISTI, it allows me to restamp if necessary without the risk of getting some shading on my stamping, so I'm choosing to use it today. I am also going to heat emboss my sentiment, which I find just adds a little bit extra to my card. I like the look of it, and it helps the sentiment stand out a bit. So to do that, I'm going to prep the surface using an anti-static tool. This is the one I have. I will link several down below so that you can see they come at very different price points, but this just keeps the embossing powder from sticking to the ink that's already on the card. So now I can take my sentiment stamp and place it where I want it on my card panel. I'm going to grab one of the ones that I've already stamped just to try and get them lined up. I think it would be really great to use these as a gift set to give to somebody, to create several in different colors and then give them to somebody as a gift. So I want them to match somewhat in the placement of the sentiment. And then I can just close the door of the MISTI to pick up that stamp, and then I can lift it up, make sure that my card panel is placed exactly back in the corner where I had it. And then I'm going to use some VersaFine Black Onyx ink. This is an ink that stays sticky for a little while, so you can emboss with it. And I don't currently have any black embossing powder. I do have clear, so if I use black ink and use clear embossing powder over the top of it, my sentiment is still going to look shiny and black without the need of having all of the different colors of embossing powder. So I wasn't entirely happy with that first stamping of the sentiment, so I'm going to go ahead and stamp it again. I use a little cloth to rub the sentiment stamp into the card front. I find I get really good stamp coverage if I do that. That's a trick I picked up from Kathy Zielski. So now that it's stamped, I'm going to set my MISTI aside and grab my embossing powder. I have my embossing powder in just a little bowl. It just makes it easier for me to add it to the card itself. I place just a sheet of copy paper down that I folded in half. That's going to help me pick up the extra embossing powder and put it back in the bowl once I'm done using it. So I'm just using a little spoon, and I'm going to spoon the embossing powder over the top of the sentiment, shake it around to make sure I get good coverage, and then just tap off the excess. I do have a clean paintbrush off to the side that I'll use just to brush away any excess embossing powder that may have stuck to the background, any places where I maybe didn't get enough of the powder tool to keep it from sticking. I can just rub that away with a clean paintbrush. So I went away and let my heat gun heat up for a few seconds. I just kind of hold it off to the side and count to 15 to make sure that it's fully heated up before applying it to the paper. If I don't do that, the paper tends to warp a bit more. You can see it did warp a bit, but I'll just place it underneath my MISTI with a heavy book on top of it, and it will flatten out no problem. Now it's finally time to go ahead and score this card. We are nearly done already. It was a very simple card to create, but I really like the end result. I think that the inking on the back over that gorgeous mum stencil is just beautiful and perfect for this time of year. So I thought I'd also show you a couple of examples of how you can take this very basic technique and add to it a bit to create a card with a bit more interest. So the first example, I've used the same inking technique and the same stencil, but I've added some other colors to it. So after applying the mustard seed ink through the stencil, I went around the edges of the stencil with a little bit of ripe persimmon to add a bit of orange to the outside petals of the flower. And then once I removed the stencil, I went over the whole thing with a little bit of tea dye distress oxide ink just to tone down the colors a bit. They felt a bit bright to me, and I wanted this to feel very warm and fall-like. So adding that tea dye over the top, just a very light brushing of that tea dye ink over the top of it, helped just tone down those very bright colors. I've also added a couple of layers to this card. So instead of inking right on the front of my card panel, I've inked on a separate sheet of Neenah Solar White cardstock and then cut that to be 3 3/4 by 5 inches so that I get that 1/4 inch border of white around all 4 sides. And then for the sentiment, I've used the Thank You Sentiments die set from Scrapbook.com. I've cut that several times out of black cardstock, glued them together, and then added those to the front of the card. I think that the extra dimension here in both the extra ink colors and in the layers of paper on the card add a lot to the overall feel of this card, even though it still uses very basic techniques. The next card I wanted to show you uses a lot of the same techniques again. So I have also inked the background of this panel in mustard seed ink. And then I've also used the mum stencil over the top to darken that yellow ink color. But before lifting up the stencil, I've added some Nuvo Glimmer Paste in Moonstone over the top of the stencil to make those petals sparkle. And I love the effect of this. Just like with the last card, I have done all this inking on a separate panel and then added it to the A2 card base using some foam tape. I've also used the same Thank You Sentiments die set to die cut the word thanks out of some black cardstock. Again, I used several layers of black cardstock and adhered them together and then glued the whole thing to the front of this card. I think that this is a gorgeous card. I would be happy to get this thank you card, and I'm sure the people you send it to will be as well. Those are the 3 cards I have to show you today. I hope you were able to find some inspiration, and I hope that you'll try these techniques for yourself. I've linked all of the products in the description box below, and I hope that you'll also check out my channel for more inspiration. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you back here very soon.